Hey there, and welcome to Chrontendo episode 34. We've now reached August 1988, but our pace is starting to slow down a bit. There are so many games in August that we can only get through half the month. Some highlights: Nintendo, having already entered the adventure game market, now takes on the military strategy type game, with a lot of success, I might add. We're also going to examine the first unlicensed NES publisher in the United States. So let's get started. We have one last game from July 1988, a US release from Capcom. If I'm not mistaken, I believe this was the first game from Capcom specifically for the Western market. This never came out in Japan, though it was designed by Capcom Japan. In fact, many of the same folks worked on Mega Man. Legendary Wings is clearly a vertical shoot-'em-up. It originally appeared in arcades in 1986 in Japan. It was called Ares no Tsubasa. One cool touch: you actually get like a quick look at the entire level, right before you actually start the level. Legendary Wings was perhaps a bit more modern looking than the games in the 1942 series, with a lot of cool details, though it actually mixed up some side-scrolling, on-foot action sequences with the shoot-'em-up levels. An interesting idea, but the game doesn't really seem to have been very successful. The most unique aspect of Legendary Wings are the optional levels. That gigantic stone hill will try to suck you in. If it succeeds, you'll have to fly through an additional horizontal scrolling level. Now in the arcade game these were done on foot, but Capcom has completely altered them to be flying shoot-'em-up levels. Generally these are not too tough, and have some sort of lame mini-boss at the very end. These worm-like creatures will come up and shoot bubbles at you. Now after you finish this, you'll fly back out of the mouth and begin the regular level right where you left off. On the other hand, there is also an optional hidden level found by blowing up a particular ground enemy. If you uncover the entrance, make sure you get sucked into the whirlpool. This is the so-called lucky level. No enemies, just strictly bonus items. You can pick up various gold statues for points, but there's also extra continues and power-ups. So about the power-ups, each time you pick one up, your weapon will be upgraded. You start with the pea-shooter laser beam, then it goes to a double beam, then a powerful jet of flame, and then three-way fireballs, and finally you transform into a fiery phoenix, with the ability to shoot multiple powerful waves of death and destruction. Normally every hit will downgrade your weapon to one level. If you get hit with a basic weapon, you'll lose a life. But in Phoenix form you can take 3 hits before your weapon gets downgraded. As long as you stay in Phoenix form, you're pretty much unstoppable. At the end of each level you'll encounter some statues for which you'll use your bombs to blow up the heads, and then you'll get a dragon mini-boss. Once you've taken care of the dragon, you'll enter the final chamber of the level. This is another horizontal level, has various laser shooting robots, and then the boss itself, which turns out to be some sort of gigantic cyber-organic ship which shoots eyeballs at you. And he has a horrifying column of brain matter which pokes out occasionally. When this happens, you have to shoot it. That's the weak spot. After a few times, he'll blow up and then you're on to the next level. I guess he's actually shooting chunks of brain at you? That's pretty disgusting. Legendary Wings has a lot going for it visually. Look at the patterns on the water, and then there's like the shadows for the platforms. You can even see the platform supports below the water surface. So graphically speaking, this is pretty cutting edge. Now there's a lot of variety in the backgrounds in each level. But gameplay-wise, Legendary Wings is sort of old-fashioned, despite the fact that the arcade game was only 2 years old. But after playing the likes of R-Type and Salamander, it seems like a relic from the previous generations of shoot-'em-ups. Each level has exactly the same structure, and at the end of each you'll encounter the same group of statues and the same dragon mini-boss, though he changes colors each time. The three-way shot is very effective on this guy, by the way. You can attack him from the side. And each level ends with you fighting the same main boss over and over. He just shoots more eyeballs at you and gets a little bit closer to you each time. Still, it does throw a few nice tricks into the mix, like these structures that you fly under, which will obstruct your view of oncoming enemies. You can even see through the portholes cut in them. That's pretty cool. Or later horizontal levels have lots of destructible blocks, and even some branching paths, which can end up with you getting trapped. Definitely has the whole H.R. Giger-esque biomechanical look down pat. Are those sperm that are attacking you? And the floors and ceilings are made out of brain matter and rib cages. It's pretty cool. Here is the Egyptians and space level with TIE fighters. As you probably realized, ground enemies need to be bombed, flying enemies are shot down with your laser, just like Xevious. Having to work both buttons at the same time means some areas can get pretty hairy if there's a lot of ground enemies and enemies in the air at the same time. Though mostly it's not too difficult. Now I'll admit I was cheating by using a turbo option for my laser. Alright, so we're getting to the final boss here. After you've defeated him, you'll blow your way through his column of brain matter. Yeesh. And then it's the real final boss. Supposedly the plot involves a supercomputer of some sort trying to destroy mankind, though the manual doesn't really bother to describe the story at all. So here's the final boss, and wow. Capcom really dropped the ball here. The guy looks like Sputnik or something. After fighting the huge brain-powered eyeball-shooting spaceship thing, this guy is pretty anticlimactic. So anyway, eventually you'll blow him up, he's not that tough, and the human race is saved. So Legendary Wings is not quite legendary, it's not bad by any means. It probably only seems disappointing after having recently played Salamander. I guess Konami set the bar too high with that one. But it is a very slick, well-made, and not super challenging shoot-'em-up. It's not too long, so it never really wears out its welcome. For shoot-'em-up fans, I'd say it's definitely recommended. Alright, here we go, Azteca 2, Taiyo no Shinden, developed by Nihon Falcom and Compile, published by the wacky Tokyo Shoseki, first game of August 1988. This game was eventually released in the West under the new name of Tombs and Treasures in 1991. A little late, there were only a couple months before the Super Nintendo was released in the US. Sometimes great delays between the Japanese and US releases will result in a game that appears quite old-fashioned when it finally comes out in the US. This intro explains the backstory. A bunch of archaeologists investigating Chichen Itza are missing. You have to go to investigate. Once again, the US version's logo on the title screen is a little bit lame. So anyway, the Japanese title, Azteca 2, leads one to believe this is in fact a sequel. Yep, Falcom's Azteca appeared on Japanese computers back in 1985. This is one of those games where you have to type everything in Japanese, so here's some screenshots I found online instead. It's an old school adventure game, much like the ones we saw back in the Adventure Game Roundup Part 1 in Chrontendo Episode 31. Then in 1987 a sequel came along, a more modern game with a graphical interface. And then lastly we have the Famicom version, which added a bunch of stuff to the computer game, like music, but also other characters and dialogue. There's this new opening scene in which you meet your two fellow adventurers and get a bit of background on the demon-infested Mayan ruins. And oh yeah, Chichen Itza was a Mayan city. So why was the game called Azteca? I don't know, all Japanese video games seem to use the word Aztec for any pre-Columbian Central and South American cultures. The menu has quite a few options: move, look, take, use, push, pull, smash, combine, as well as rarely used ones like wash. It works just like your standard adventure game with a first-person viewpoint, except that when you're moving around on the overworld, you get these three super deformed figures moving around. Looks kind of like Dragon Quest II. The overworld is 8 screens by 8 screens in size, with about 8 locations of interest. So quite a bit of it is just sort of grass and trees and various structures that you can't enter. Though the layout is actually a pretty good approximation of the real Chichen Itza. Most structures inside are pretty small, sometimes literally only one room. In each room you'll find various objects and hidden items and like little puzzle-like things. You'll also occasionally find enemy encounters, and this is where Tombs and Treasures adds completely superficial RPG elements to the game. You fight simply by hitting attack over and over again. There's no magic, healing items, or anything like that. It's just literally selecting the attack option from the menu several times in a row. You have hit points and levels, but they don't really mean anything. You never need to restore hit points as a rule. Well, in fact, you can't. There's no way of doing that. Generally, these enemy encounters happen when you first enter a particular ruin. Also, in rooms, lots of times tombs and treasures will have like lots and lots of items. Some you can pick up, others when you try, the game simply tells you can't pick it up, no explanation given. You also need to find items by hitting things, looking in things, that sort of activity. For example, selecting the move option and then clicking on the pile of gold, which you cannot pick up for some reason, will reveal an important item. You also need to smash one of the vases. You can try to smash everything else in the room, but nothing else is smashable except for that one vase, which happens to have an item inside. So basically, you just look at each item, and then try taking each item, then hitting each item, then moving and pushing and so on. Just keep going until you've exhausted the possibilities. And then you move on to another area and find more items. The puzzles usually consist of placing an item in a gap in the wall to unlock a hidden door, that sort of thing. The game doesn't really give you any sorts of hints, so everything's just trial and error, though many are completely obvious. Correctly finding items and using them will increase your level. The level has no bearing on the game other than the battles. You can't even see your level at any time except for when you're in the middle of a battle. What it boils down to is this: if you haven't reached the correct level for a particular enemy, the demon will always dodge your attacks and do massive damage and you'll get killed quickly. This means you haven't done something you were supposed to do before entering that particular area. In other words, enemy encounters are how the game imposes linearity on the game. Here I visited some other rooms. I've got my level up, but now I can defeat this particular guy easily. But these levels don't really work anything like regular RPG levels. You can't grind or anything like that, and you can only fight each encounter once. In other words, the RPG elements are completely superficial. Tombs and Treasures is quite short if you know what you're doing. It's the trial and error that makes the game longer, but there's no sort of plot development here. The challenge consists entirely of finding every item and sort of figuring out what to do with it. Unfortunately, Tombs and Treasures is not really much fun. Next up, a military-themed game, though not a strategy game per se, more of a straightforward action game. The publisher is Soft Pro International, the guys behind Breeder, which made the Chrontendo Worst 10 Games of 1983-1987, and Noinsane, among others. I really hate this title screen. What's with the crazy checkerboard pattern? What does it have to do with tank battles? It's more appropriate for a retro-themed diner than blowing people up with tanks. And the programmers are trying to show off their awesome color modulation effect. If nothing else, it's impressive that 4 people can play at once. We're just going to be doing one player today. So start picking your tank. Options are Osa, Mat, Oka. What does all that mean? What's the difference? Well, that's revealed if you check out the option to create your own tank. From the very first screen there's a customize option. You can assign attribute points RPG style. There's a few blank slots to create and customize tanks, and you can even name them yourself. Alright, so let's go back to the main game. It's loading up here. Stage 0? Alright, flip the disc and... What? Insert to fucking box? This game just dropped the F-bomb on me? Can video games do that? I know that in Japan, publishers manufacture their own discs and carts, so Nintendo didn't need to approve the content. But still, I guess no one noticed this because no one played the game? That's still utterly baffling to me. Well, anyway, let's go ahead and get started here. This looks pretty lame. I assume this takes place during Patton's push into France after the Normandy landing. At least that's what the appearance of the Marseillaise in the intro made me think. So what you do is drive around and shoot the other 3 tanks. Once the tank blows up, you can then shoot the driver. Amazingly, you can run the driver over and it doesn't hurt him. No, you have to shoot him. Oh geez, his head came off. Ooh. Now, once you've cleared the field, you'll then move on to level 01. So this far into the game and already they're getting all cutesy on us. Well, Patton-Kun greatly resembles an old Namco game called Battle City, covered back in Chrontendo 5, but despite being a much newer game, it's much worse than Namco's game. I'd say that if you need a tank combat game, either play Battle City or break out the old Atari 2600 and play Combat. So, HAL Laboratory returns. We haven't seen a game from them since Firebam back in February. Eggerland, Meikyuu no Fukkatsu, Revival of the Labyrinth. We just recently saw Hitler no Fukkatsu. Maybe that word sounds good in video game titles in Japan. Well, this is the third Eggerland game, the first being a computer exclusive, the second coming out on computers and on the Famicom disk system, and this one only on the Famicom in cartridge form. Sadly, where the Famicom disk system Eggerland had a cool animated cutscene in the intro, this one just has like a little demo on how to play the game. Maybe this is due to matters of space. This is a pretty big game, 162 levels. Quick refresher on how Eggerland is played. You need to collect all the hearts in each room in order to unlock a chest and retrieve the key. This generally involves pushing around blocks, Silkband style, and avoiding monsters. You will occasionally acquire weapons, such as a projectile that turns a monster into an egg temporarily, but much of the time you simply have to avoid them. Some monsters will chase after you once the chest is opened, whereas others will be active at all times. Some monsters are stationary and will zap you if you enter their line of sight, others will move around and chase you. Moving blocks to protect yourself is required to complete most levels. Here, for example, I'm going to need to move around, push around that block in the upper right-hand corner there to block one of those purple monsters. They'll start shooting fire at you as soon as you open the chest. Now let me clarify just one thing. You'll often see it stated online that Adventures of Lolo is the English version of this game. That's not really true. This game was only released in Japan. Adventures of Lolo was a Western exclusive that combined levels from the earlier installments. There are levels from this game in Adventures of Lolo, but really they're still different games. So I'd say it's pretty nice to see another Eggerland game. What's strange is that HAL will release another Eggerland game on the FDS later this month. Why they put two games in the same series so close together is anyone's guess. Hey, it's a game from Sofil, one of the more obscure Famicom publishers. One thing, the name MMI appears on the title screen. Who are they? The developer? Possibly. I know nothing about them. We've already seen a couple weird games from them already. Kokona World, sort of a Kitty Zelda game, and Game Tengoku, a mini-game collection. Money Game, as you might imagine, is a stock market simulation type game. This is actually the second such Famicom game. The first being Matsumoto Toru no Kabushiki Hishugaku, which came out in February 1988. That one was from Imagineer, which, like Sofil, started in computers, so not surprisingly their games more resemble computer games than arcade titles. The main screen shows your cash, as well as your total assets, and the dollar to yen exchange rate. Start off with 1 million yen, or around $7,000. In your Spartan little room, you have the tools of your trade. You can check the financial columns in the paper or read news stories. You can also use your computer to check your finances or buy and sell stocks. Now, if this looks familiar to some of you, that's because the sequel ended up being released in the United States under the name Wall Street Kid. Various improvements were made to the second game. Your financial advisor is no longer talking radish, for example, but the basic gameplay is the same. Well, the goal of the money game is to make a lot of money, and you'll need to get a fancy car such as a BMW or a Bensu, and a house and make your girlfriend happy. So it's sort of a bourgeois lifestyle stimulation game, I suppose. It feeds into the player's fantasy of making it rich the easy way, through the stock market, and acquiring the tokens of success. I guess it was probably a pretty common dream for Japanese folks during the economic boom of the 1980s. We've got one here from Pack-In Video, the video distributor that decided to try their hand at software and game development. This is Silviana, sometimes also called Sylvania. Unfortunately, there's no English name on the box or title screen to definitively settle the matter of English pronunciation. This was never released outside of Japan, but we have a very helpful English translation from Mute. Not too many FDS games get translated, so count your blessings. So Silviana's mother is sick and she needs to find a cure. Well, that's certainly a change from most RPG plots, sort of like Kid Cool or Nier. Of course, in RPG land, you can't go fetch some medicine without wiping out every living creature on the planet. Don't get the idea there's any stuff in those drawers. The only furniture in the whole house is some chest of drawers, and there's nothing at all in them. In fact, there are nothing hidden found in any houses or anything like that. It's pretty much all treasure chests found in dungeons. Silviana is an action RPG of the simplest variety. You fight simply by walking into monsters. Unlike Ease or even Hidelight, there doesn't seem to be like a right way or a wrong way to fight. You just walk into them. And you'll always take a certain amount of damage, depending on the type of monster. While this is sort of clearly visually based on Dragon Quest, calling it an RPG might be making it appear deeper than it really is. There are no levels, experience points, magic, or any stats beyond your hit points. The only thing you get from killing monsters is gold and the occasional item. But you don't actually pick up gold automatically, you have to go back and pick up the bag that they drop after you kill them, which gets really tiresome and annoying. So this is either the world's simplest RPG or a Zelda clone made up to look like Dragon Quest. There are these towns where you can buy items like weapons and shields. Weapons increase your attack power and shields your defense. You heal by buying a cup of tea rather than sleeping at an inn. Dungeons here are pretty basic. Each has a few chests and some important item to collect or a person to speak to. The main thing you want to pick up in dungeons, aside from quest items, are hearts. These increase your maximum hit points. Interestingly, in the second half of the game, you enter what's called the Demon World, which is the same world map, only backwards, sort of a similar idea to the one used much later in Link to the Past. And there's actually an important item called the Ocarina as well. Oh, and by the way, Internet, the word is Ocarina, not Ocarina. I know I'm the last person in the world who should be complaining about this sort of thing, but Ocarina is a pretty common English word and there's really no sort of ambiguities in the way that it's supposed to be pronounced. Another Zelda-like feature, the dungeons will usually feature bosses at the end. The encounters are sort of like Zelda bosses, only, they're not very fun. So Silviana, one of the most remedial RPGs we've seen in a while, and really not that interesting. Hopefully Pack-In will produce some more interesting stuff in the future. Hey, how would you like another Manyuuki game? Well, we sort of have one today. Tatake Ramen-Man is a Manyuuki spin-off game. First of all, note the title screen. It's copyrighted to Shinsei. Many online sources like GameFAQs list the publisher as Bandai, but it was technically from these Shinsei folks, who are also a toy company, most well known for their UFO Commander series of toys. At some point, they became connected with Bandai. Maybe Bandai merged with them, so I suppose that Bandai was using them as some sort of subsidiary publisher. Anyway, Ramen-Man was a character from the Manyuuki series, the superhero wrestling series, which produced 2 terrible video games so far. He received his own spin-off cartoon show, Tatake Ramen-Man, and even a movie that came out in summer of 1988. He was, as you might guess, a wrestler of Chinese descent, and this game seems to take place in historical China or some sort of mythical Asian land. Now this is a pretty odd game, sort of a cross between an adventure game and a one-on-one fighting game. The interface is pretty unique. Hitting A will make a cursor appear. You can then move around the cursor to interact with objects. Clicking on a door, for example, will cause Ramen-Man to walk over to the door and then enter it. Or if you click on a certain area of the screen, Ramen-Man will walk over to it. Or you can select the other commands from the list down there at the bottom. To pick something up, click on the Take command, and then the object, and you'll pick it up. If it's an interactive object, that is. To get rid of the cursor and just walk around normally, you have to move the cursor over to Ramen-Man and then hit B. Then just using the D-pad will cause your character to move around. In many ways, this is the closest we've seen so far to a Sierra-style point-and-click adventure game. The interconnected screens and controls make it sort of resemble like an entry in the King's Quest or Space Quest series. One thing though, the game world seems to be pretty boring. You mostly just wander around talking to certain folks and then finding objects that are sort of randomly hidden. For example, you'll find a locked entrance to a cave. You need the key, so you walk all the way back to the other side of the game world and find the key stuck in a boulder, and then you walk back all the way. This wouldn't be so bad if Ramen-Man didn't walk around so damned slowly. In total, it looks like about 90% of the game is simply walking back and forth, as far as I can tell. This game was developed by Human, who work quite a bit with Bandai. At this point, I guess they haven't really gotten the hang of making great games, though this is certainly more professional looking than some of the other Bandai games. There are some nice touches, like the way your sprite shrinks down when you move into the background. The environments could certainly use a bit more variety. This section in particular comprises multiple identical backgrounds. It's impossible to know where you are. There's really no way of knowing if the edge leads to like a new area or not. Usually games will put some sort of visible obstacle to indicate that you can't move in that direction. But this game, uses the literal invisible walls. Just try walking over to the edge, and if you can't, well then I guess, try going in a different direction. At times you will encounter enemies, then the game switches to a very rudimentary fighting game. You can hit or kick high, middle, or low, but there don't seem to be any combos or blocking as far as I can tell. For this guy, repeatedly punching him in the nuts works really well, as I suppose it would in real life. Can you imagine being punched in the balls until you black out? It's a horrible thought. But Ramen-Man was sometimes pretty brutal in the Manyuuki cartoon. So I wouldn't call this a good game, but it does show, I suppose, some sort of progress over earlier Manyuuki games. Something that we do eventually have to cover is unlicensed games, so let's start with the first US unlicensed publisher, Tengen, who, as most of you already know, is simply Atari. It's an interesting story, so let's take a look at the background. Now, Atari was created in 1971 by a couple ex-Ampex engineers, Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney, originally under the name Syzygy. Their first game was called Computer Space and was manufactured by Nutting Associates. This was the first ever commercial arcade video game. It was not a hit, and Nolan and Dabney parted ways with Nutting and changed their name from Syzygy to Atari. They then hired an engineer named Al Alcorn, who designed Atari's first arcade game, Pong. Pong was a huge hit and pretty much single-handedly triggered the video game craze of the 1970s. Long story short, Atari pumped out tons of popular arcade games as well as home versions of Pong. They even opened up a Japanese branch and hired a guy called Hide Nakajima to run it. By 1976, Dabney was out, and Bushnell wanted to expand in new directions, but lacked the capital, so he sold the company to Warner Communications. Thereafter, the Atari VCS, or the Atari 2600, was launched, eventually becoming the first really successful home video game console. But Bushnell and the suits at Warner disagreed about various things, and in 1978 Bushnell was fired, or rather, let go with the golden parachute. Atari then continued to make tons of money for Warner, with both their 2600 and 5200 consoles, the Atari 8-bit computers, and arcade games like Asteroids. Then the video game crash of 1983 to 1984 hit, and suddenly Atari was losing money. So Warner decided to sell. Now here's where things get a little bit confusing. You all know about Atari's struggles and lawsuits with Nintendo, but it's important to remember that there are actually two separate companies called Atari at this point, both of which engaged in legal battles with Nintendo. In 1984, there were several divisions of Atari, including the home division that made consoles and computers, and the arcade division. In July 1984, Jack Tramiel, former president of Commodore, purchased the home division and called it Atari Corporation. Under Trammell, Atari Corporation released the 7800 and the Atari ST computers. Trammell laid off a lot of Atari employees and brought over a lot of Commodore employees. The whole thing was almost kind of like an attempt to get revenge on Commodore. And then in 1985, Namco bought the majority of the arcade division of Atari, now called Atari Games. Remember Hide Nakajima, the guy who ran Atari Japan? Well, Namco took over Atari Japan back in the 70s, and Nakajima moved to Namco and ended up running Namco's American division. After the Namco purchase, he was sent to run Atari Games. Atari Games continued to release arcade titles like Gauntlet, Paperboy, 720 Degrees, and so on. Then in 1987, Nakajima and some of the other employees bought a chunk of Namco's share of Atari Games, resulting in Namco no longer having a controlling share. Nakajima then left Namco and became president of Atari Games. Presumably all of this was approved by Namco. It was Nakajima's Atari Games that created Tengen in 1987. Originally as a 100% license by Nintendo publisher. If you ever wondered why Atari was releasing games for the NES when they had their own console, the 7800, well, this is the reason why. There were actually two different Ataris. Now, it's hard to say how much influence Namco had over Atari Games. They still owned about 40%, but Namco never really seemed to care for Nintendo, and Atari Games seemed determined to kind of screw them over. Immediately after becoming a Nintendo licensee, and I mean immediately, like 1 week later, they lied to the US Copyright Office to obtain a copy of the computer code for the Nintendo lockout chip, the 10NES. Without this chip, carts would not play on the Nintendo Entertainment System. Atari Games used this info to create a workaround chip. Now, while they were doing this, they actually released the first 3 Tengen games in summer of 1988, a US version of Namco's Pac-Man, released on the Famicom in 1984, RBI Baseball, which was a localization of Namco's Family Stadium, and lastly, Gauntlet, which was a port of the arcade game. All of these were officially licensed games. Then, in December 1988, they broke ties with Nintendo and re-released these 3 games with the new workaround chip installed, thus avoiding the need to have their releases approved and manufactured by Nintendo. These were the first unlicensed games. Naturally, lawsuits and counter-lawsuits were filed. These dragged on until the mid-1990s, but basically Atari got busted for fraudulently obtaining Nintendo's code. By this time, Warner had actually bought back the rest of Atari Games, started releasing games for the Genesis, and eventually closed down the Tengen label in 1994, and unfortunately Hide Nakajima died that year as well. So what happened to the two Ataris? Well, Trammell's Atari Corporation launched the handheld Lynx in 1989 and the Jaguar in 1993, and continued with the home computer line as well. As you may have heard, the Lynx and Jaguar were not very successful. The Jaguar was discontinued just in a couple of years. They also sued Nintendo a couple times as well, for antitrust violations among other things. Atari Corporation was sold to a company called JTS in 1996 and then Hasbro in 1998. And the French company, Infogrames, in 2001. By this point, Atari was more of a collection of copyrights, properties, and logos than like an actual game company. Infogrames brought another company called JT Interactive and changed its name to Atari. This company is still around today, so when you see the name Atari on stuff like Neverwinter Nights, or the new Alone in the Dark game, or those Atari flashback things, or the collections of old 2600 games, that's these guys. It's really just Infogrames using Atari's name. And as for Nakajima's Atari games, well, after Tengen disappeared, Warner sold them to Williams Midway, the American arcade company, in 1996. They kept still putting out arcade games like Area 51 and released compilations of old Atari arcade games for consoles. Perhaps to avoid confusion with the other Atari, the name was changed to Midway West in 2000, occasionally releasing a new Gauntlet or Area 51 game. Finally, in 2003, Midway shut down Midway Games West, pretty much killing off the last piece of the original Atari. Well, of these 3 Tengen releases, 2 of them, RBA Baseball and Pac-Man, we've already seen in previous episodes of Chrontendo when their original Japanese versions came out. Gauntlet, on the other hand, is a brand new release, released sometime in summer 1988. No one seems to know exactly when. In fact, this game was never released in Japan at all. So here's our first Tengen developed game, Gauntlet. The arcade version didn't really have music, so they just lifted and slightly altered a piece of classical music. And they came up with this snazzy title screen that summarizes the game nicely. Though the alternating colors on the logo reminds me of something you'd see like on an old Atari 2600 game. I guess old habits die hard. So Gauntlet was originally an arcade game from 1985, known for a few things. Its blatantly D&D inspired setting, not something much seen in arcades at the time, and it allowed for 4-player simultaneous co-op. Gauntlet cabinets had these huge control panels, also lots and lots of speech samples. Your health would get low and your wizard is about to die, or whatever. It was enormously popular in arcades. I remember always seeing people crowded around Gauntlet cabinets. And of course, the game had an unreal number of enemies on the screen at all times. So how does the NES version stack up? Well, not very well. First of all, only 2 people can play at once. I know it's to be expected, but still, it's a bit disappointing. And the NES Gauntlet is not a pretty looking game. I don't know, just something about the color schemes, the characters, this just looks unappealing to me. Especially after compared to something with a lot of visual appeal, like Legendary Wings. Maybe it's the Western style of top-down perspective on the characters, I don't know. One thing that is impressive is the way Tengen managed to get so many enemies on the screen at once. I don't really know how that works. Are the enemies background tiles instead of sprites or something? Anybody have any ideas? Well, I'd say the main problem with Gauntlet is that it just does not convert very well to a console game. The arcade game was like a real quarter muncher. Your health is constantly decreasing, you tend to get hit a lot, you're going to have to keep putting quarters in when playing Gauntlet. The console version has been changed up a bit. There is now an ending when you reach the 100th dungeon, you have passwords, but it's still a very simple dungeon crawler that's pretty damned repetitive. There are a few items to pick up: bombs, health refills, and your character will get stronger as the game progresses, but it more resembles Commando than other D&D inspired games like Rogue. So while Gauntlet is fun for a while, it's eventually sort of tiring. We have here 2 Jaleco sports games, both released on August 10th, and the first one is Big Challenge, Judo Senshuken, which means Judo Championship. This is the first of several sports games in Jaleco's Big Challenge series. This is definitely the first judo game we've seen for the system, though we did have a sumo game earlier. This looks like it might have a similar mechanic to the sumo games, but it's really hard to tell. The bottom line is this: I have absolutely no idea how to play this game. I suppose that's why it's a possibility when you're playing a virtually forgotten Japanese game and you don't have a manual, but I really could not figure this out at all. I see it has some sort of power meter at the bottom. What exactly causes it to go up or down, I'm not really sure. It's not clear what the buttons do. One button seems to cause you to kick your opponent, but this doesn't ever seem effective. I tried various button and D-pad combos and button mashing to see if I could execute a throw or something, but nope, sorry. One thing I can tell you that's maybe a bit more interesting than this game is about an important figure in the history of Judo. Judo was a spin-off of Jiu-Jitsu. It was sort of a more fluid and flexible form of Jiu-Jitsu, invented in the late 19th century. The most famous early Judo expert was Shiro Saigo. This guy was literally the first black belt ever. Later, one of his judo associates wrote a novel called Sagata Sanshiro, based on him. Akira Kurosawa adapted the novel into his first film. The Sagata Sanshiro movie was quite popular, and of course the character was much later parodied by Sega with their Sagata Sanshiro ad campaign. Now you know. I somehow accidentally won a few matches, but I don't really know how. Most of the time the match ended with the other guy suddenly flashing and then tossing me to the ground. Looking online, it seems this game is regarded as Kosoge in Japan, and no one seems to particularly care about it, so I guess it's no big loss. At this point, will we ever go a single episode at a baseball game? Probably not. Jaleco released a second game on August 10th, this time a sequel to Moero Pro Yaku, aka Bases Loaded. In Japan, this was called Moero Pro Yaku 88, how original. And in the US, Bases Loaded 2, second season, which sounds a little repetitive to me. Just like the first one, it uses some impressive sounding speech clips. It also has that damn chink 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 thing going on constantly in the background. And when it came time for a US release, once again it received a really ugly new logo. Just like the first game, this was from Tosa. No real team names or players are used, just city names and some made-up players, though some of the player names get a little cutesy. You have some basic management options. You can switch up the batting order, bring in a reserve player, and naturally choose your starting pitcher. But really the game is action-based. Controls are perhaps simpler than most baseball video games. You can't move your batter or pitcher around. Pitchers can throw a fastball or a slow ball, and you can control the direction with a D-pad while the ball is in midair. But unlike so many baseball games, it's possible, even likely, to strike out the CPU. It'll actually swing and miss, unlike those games where the computer will just hit every single pitch. No matter how hard I tried, however, I couldn't bean the batter. Likewise, when batting, it's possible to get decent hits in. Using the D-pad, you can control the swing of the bat. Pretty easy to use. But unlike the first Bases Loaded, this one doesn't switch the camera angle when you're at the bat. This makes it, in my opinion, harder to see where the ball is. Often it's difficult to distinguish strikes from balls. As before, a home run will initiate a little animation of the pitcher hanging his head in shame, while the batter cheerfully jogs past. I've actively disliked a lot of baseball games so far, but Bases Loaded 2 is pretty inoffensive and even reasonably fun. I don't really have too many complaints about it, so I'll put it near the top of the list of baseball games we've seen so far. Alright, we got a new one here from Sunsoft, but once again, don't expect another Blaster Master. What we do have here is a whole lot of crazy synthesized speech. This is Mitokoumon Sekai Manyuuki, the second Mitokoumon game. For those with short memories, Mitokoumon is a very long-running Japanese TV show about a Tokugawa-era official who disguises himself as a commoner and travels through Japan solving crimes and righting wrongs, along with his many faithful companions. The first Mitokoumon game, which I assume by some coincidence came out on August 11th, 1987, exactly 1 year before this one. The big deal about that game was that there was a lot of speech used. This one's the same way. Every time you walk into a shop or something, the person says hello. Now the second Mitokoumon game, however, goes into full crazy mode, as Mitokoumon and his friends travel around the world to the Wild West, Italy, China, India, Hawaii, and even Transylvania to meet Dracula. I don't know why Sunsoft decided to go in such a weird direction with this game, but it seems to look forward to such titles as Tengen Meikyuu with its crazy mix-up of Japanese and Western history. You get to choose which of the two samurai retainers you want to play, Kaku-san or Suka-san. The game works a lot like the first one. You check around town, talking to townspeople, getting clues, buying items in shops. You can attack bad guys, but you aren't supposed to kill friendly townspeople. For some reason this western town has wild bulls just running around. You can kill those and they'll drop items. Certain enemies will drop useful items, which allows you to temporarily switch characters. The pinwheel, for example, allows you to use the ninja character for a minute who can jump over obstacles. You'll need to switch characters from time to time to enter certain buildings or areas. There are also gambling minigames, and I think that if you buy a drink in the bar, your character will be more difficult to control for a while, which is very interesting. Mitokoumon 2 is definitely nicer looking than the first game, and perhaps a bit slicker. I'm not really sure how well the wacky globe-trotting theme went over with the TV show fans, but the whole thing looks pretty interesting. We start this one off with some classic English. The game in question is Soccer League Winners' Cup. There are 1 or 2 player options, and you get to choose which country you play. Most of the standard options are here: Japan, Germany, France, UK, Brazil, United States, so on. As far as I know, all these teams are the same. Now once you've made your selections, you'll need to choose from several different formations. Basically, it depends on whether you want to focus more on defense or offense. Data East is one of those publishers that are all over the place in terms of content and quality. Earlier this year we had a pretty decent game called Gauntlet, and next were 2 adventure games. And now we have a low-grade soccer game. Consider the controls. A kicks the ball, sometimes, and B does nothing. That's right, they don't even use the second button on the control pad. Except when you hit A and B together, you'll do some kind of weird slide thing. So how do you pass and kick? Well, in this game it's actually the same thing. Hitting A simply kicks the ball. To pass, you kick the ball towards one of your teammates. The little circle around you shows which direction you're pointed in, for both moving and kicking. Here's the thing, however, you don't seem to be able to kick if you're running. I kept hitting the A button while running and nothing happened. If you hit A while you're not moving, yeah, then you'll kick. And I guess technically you can kick while running if you hit the button at the exact same moment the ball touches your foot, but still not being able to easily kick while running pretty much hamstrings the game. And there are some other issues, however, like the fact that your goalie moves at the same time that you move the player you're currently controlling. You can't see very far down the field, so it's not uncommon to unwittingly position your goalie in a bad spot. Like here, for example. Hey, my goalie's all the way down at the bottom, and I didn't have time to move into place to block that ball. That kind of stuff happens all the time while playing this. And often when you're throwing the ball back from out of bounds, you can't even see your teammates. On the other hand, they did bother to put in a little halftime show, which I guess is reasonably cute. So, Soccer League Winners' Cup is pretty wretched. I'd call it the stick hunter of soccer games. So another minor failure for Data East. If there's one thing I definitely didn't want to encounter this episode, it was another Dragon Ball game. Yep, from Bandai and Tosa, it's the second Famicom Dragon Ball game. The first one, as you might recall, actually was released in the West under the name Dragon Power. This game and its sequels were Japan-only titles. I don't think any Dragon Ball games got released over here until the Dragon Ball Z animated series became super popular in the 90s. The title screen art is actually pretty decent though, and the game is a bit more ambitious than the first one. So what's going on here? This starts you in some sort of like adventure game mode. You're stuck inside this house, and you find a dead body of one of your friends. You can't leave the house until you do a certain amount of investigating and speaking to the correct NPCs. Unfortunately, you can move around from room to room, and usually the NPCs are all silent when you try to talk to them. I had a difficult time trying to figure out the trigger to get the game to move forward, eventually looking at a playthrough video. And I don't feel so bad because the Japanese guy responsible for the video, who probably knows way more about this stuff than I do, it took him like 7 minutes of looking and trying every single thing before he got out of the house. So once you're out, you immediately run into one of the series' villains, and you have one of those RPG game battles where it's impossible for you to win. You get defeated, and then you wake up back at the damned house. Luckily, it's not as difficult to leave the second time, and then once you do, the real game begins. The full title is Dragon Ball Daimaou Fukkatsu, meaning like a Demon King's revival. Again, with the Fukkatsu in the name, we're seeing that all the time. This is actually sort of a weird and new approach to RPG type game. You move and fight by using cards. Now this is not uncommon nowadays, but back in 1988 this must have been cutting edge. I don't know if this was the first video game to use this mechanic. It's quite possible Japanese computer games had already been doing this, but it also does fit into the board game genre we've been seeing, like those Game of Life video games. You have 5 cards visible at all times. To move, you pick a card and you move that many spaces. Between turns, you generally get to pick a random card which will either do nothing or do something positive like restore health or start a battle. When battling, basically you and your opponent throw down cards, and whoever has the highest number attacks the other guy for some damage. There's also cards with special attacks and so on. There's like a Janken, like a rock, paper, scissors attack you have, for example. So the game is unusual for the time as an RPG board game hybrid. Later Dragon Ball games would all use a very similar mechanic to this. From what I understand, the game follows the manga and anime pretty closely. One thing that's interesting, it doesn't pick up where the first game left off. I guess it skips quite a bit. The villain is like this green reptilian guy whose name is, get this, Piccolo. That's Italian for small. Not a very scary name, but there are a lot of silly names in Dragon Ball. The game seems halfway decent for a Tosa-developed cash-in game. I'm surprised it's never been translated into English since just about every other Dragon Ball game in the universe has received an English fan translation. Maybe one of these days. Namco decides to put in an appearance today with Final Lap, a racing game, and also a port of their 1987 arcade game. You know, like a lot of racing games, you race on a series of increasingly difficult tracks. In this case, you do quite a bit of content hopping, driving in races all over the world. Namco even went so far as to create portraits and stats of each of your opponents. Not surprisingly, you assign points to your car's attributes. Better get some nitro here. These can be adjusted between each race. You'll get additional points every so often. In other words, Final Lap has a nice flaky RPG crust to it. As an F1 racing game, you might think, it looks quite a bit like Pole Position. Well, you're correct. Final Lap isn't the official sequel to Pole Position, it's sort of its spiritual sequel, as we would say nowadays. The arcade game was a pretty standard racing game, though one with fancy 3D graphics thanks to Namco's new System 2 board. Unfortunately, it had some problems mapping the controls. Obviously, the arcade game uses a steering wheel. Final Lap hit arcades at the very end of 1987 and was actually the first game to use the System 2 board. Clearly, the Famicom could not even come close to producing those kind of graphics. In fact, aside from being an F1 racing game, there really isn't too much to connect this to the original arcade title. Seems like it was ported by some company called Nova. I guess they're an obscure contract developer. Namco did give us a 2-player option, which means dividing the screen in half. When you're playing, I'm actually on the top half here. Though this means that Final Lap uses sort of small sprites for the cars. As a racing game, it's not bad, it looks pretty decent, handles okay, it's difficult to go around corners smoothly for some reason. Controls are very simple, one button for the accelerator and the other one's for the brake. There's not even a gear shift. Pressing up on the D-pad will activate the nitrous oxide. And when you hit another car, you sort of spin around for a sec rather than exploding into like a ball of flame. So it's a decent, if no frills, F1 racing game. I guess give it a try if that's your thing. You know what I like? When an episode of Chrontendo goes out with a bang. And that's what's happening today because our last game is Famicom Wars. You know what we haven't seen in very many Nintendo published games? Fancy animated title sequences. Well, Nintendo finally steps up to the plate. This is one of the coolest opening animations we've seen on the Famicom so far. And check out that music. And look how awesome the logo is. Everything about it is very cool. And then from there, you get all these different options. You can even change the background music. There weren't that many games with that particular option back then. So clearly Famicom Wars is a military simulation game, very similar to Bandai's Gundam SD game or Tank Commander or Noinsane, except much better. You choose a battle. There are 15 maps available, compared to Tank Commander's 5, I believe. As you can see, neither side starts with any units, but you do have buildings and factories. From the main menu option, you can start building units. The production capabilities in early levels is somewhat limited to ground units, but you can make infantry, tanks, transports, artillery, and even supply trucks. Combat units tend to have 2 strength levels. For example, you can make a tank, or a more expensive medium tank, which is much stronger. As you would expect, the best defense is a good offense. Creating infantry to take over neutral buildings is probably your first order of business. You'll also want some tanks and artillery to protect the infantry. The amount of gold you get each turn is based on how many buildings you have under control, so obviously getting a head start on capturing some buildings is really a good idea. Now each type of unit has its own strengths and weaknesses. Howitzers, for example, can completely pound ground units from afar, but are pretty much defenseless up close. Having some howitzers behind your front lines can be very helpful. And of course, enemy artillery will annoy you to no end. There is a real feeling of triumph that you get when you're finally able to break through enemy lines and take out their artillery, especially if that artillery has been destroying your heavy tanks. You also have to consider ammunition. Each unit has a finite amount and will need to be resupplied, either at a friendly building or the supply truck. Also important to note, you cannot stack multiple units on one square, and only certain units like infantry can cross mountains. And additionally, terrain factors into battles. Sometimes, like in this first level here, your units can sort of encounter a bottleneck when there's like a small winding path between the mountains in order to get into enemy territory. But altogether, there's a whole lot of things in this game to consider. It's not exactly Civilization or anything like that, but it has that same sort of addictive one more turn feeling to it. Now unfortunately, Famicom Wars was never released in the United States. This is an unofficial English translation from AKA Translations. Sequels were released on the Game Boy and the Super Famicom, but the series actually did not come to the US until 2001, with Advance Wars for the Game Boy Advance. This was in fact one of the very first Game Boy Advance titles released in the US, and ended up being considered one of the best games for the system. Since then the series has of course continued on the Nintendo DS. Now, as I mentioned, there are 15 campaigns altogether, and they can be quite long, so there's really like a huge amount of value to Famicom Wars. Later levels will introduce different types of aircraft and ships. These of course are built in airports and naval bases. Most of the titles in the Wars series were developed by the Nintendo second-party developer Intelligent Systems. Now they were originally like one-man operation and did some programming on some of the early Famicom titles, but before too long they expanded and were soon developing games in this series and in the strategy RPG series Fire Emblem, as well as later some of the Mario RPG titles. I guess that pretty much everything about Famicom Wars stands head and shoulders over the competitors' military games. The music is fantastic, the animated battles are nice, the battles are short and to the point. They're not all long and drawn out like those in the SD Gundam game. There's a lot of variety in the campaigns, and the difficulty ramps up pretty nicely. Pretty much everything you could want in an early 8-bit military game is here. Why Nintendo never localized this is anybody's guess. Next time, we finally make it to September. And what are we going to see? Well, how about a Konami game that everyone hates? Another Eggerland game, the first entry in a long-running and beloved RPG series, 3 Pony Canyon games, and a classic American adventure game that gets the first of 2 ports to the Famicom. See you then.
Jugok 4000年の伝統の味